developing a business strategy is very hard. First, the board must decide when to develop a strategy. The actual question of when you develop a strategy is actually very complicated. It's not obvious, and usually it's put off until too late. Strategy requires vision and what's sometimes called strategic awareness of what's going on in the rest of the industry, what's going on in the rest of the world, what's going on in other institutions. Strategy requires a deep, deep knowledge of the industry, the customers, and the trends in the industry. Right? You can't really do strategy properly unless you look outwards and forget about your day-to-day problems. Strategy requires very specialized skills to be able to analyze complex situations, and it also requires creativity because you've got to think about new directions. And most of all, strategy requires courage to take tough decisions and to follow them through. And one of the toughest decisions is actually to decide when to abandon a strategy if it's going wrong. That is a really tough one. So strategy is not only about objectives, it's also about how you're going to go there. Right? So if you've got an airy-fairy strategy saying we're going to be the best in India, that's not a strategy. That's an aspiration. Strategy is we're going to be the best in India, and this is how we're going to do it. The second part is as important as the first. Implicit in any strategy is a definition of the vision or the strategic direction. And without a clear sort of strategic direction, it doesn't have to be too specific. It will not be possible to set the objectives, both monetary and non-monetary, that's important, that the firm wishes to achieve. So having defined the objectives, we need to set up the policies needed to achieve those objectives. Another way to look at a strategy is to look at what's called a business model. Business model has become very important in understanding strategy. What is a business model? A business model is something that gives value to customers. So really what you're trying to do is you're trying to move from your current business model, something I call a strategic baseline, where we are today, to a desired business model, a strategic position. Where do we want to be over in the future at a specific time? And in order to do that, you have to develop some sort of strategic plan and framework. And in order to achieve that strategic plan and framework, you need a lot of resources. You need people, you need capital, you need assets, and most important, you need time. A strategic position is uncertain, okay? Because there are pressures from outside, there's regulatory pressures, there's pressures from customers, there's pressures from technology, right? Uncertainty, the management of uncertainty is the management of risk. You first of all have to identify the risks in your future position. You also have to identify the risks in your current position. Not all current positions are riskless, right? You may well be about to be overtaken by a competitor, right? On a year-by-year basis. So what we're talking about is an uncertain present, an uncertain future, and an uncertain set of resources to get from here to there. Uncertainty is about risk, right? How do we manage uncertainty? I know there's an academic discussion about the difference between uncertainty and risk, which is too academic. We're dealing with managing uncertainty. We're dealing with managing risk. So if you've got a strategy, you're immediately in the strategic risk environment. If we knew what it was going to be like a year from now, it would be easy. We have no idea. And we're not talking a year, we're talking 5 years, right? We have no idea. So one of the messages I want to get across is the minute you start talking about strategy, you talk about uncertainty and the management of uncertainty, which is risk management. Yeah? They go together. Has anybody seen Alexander Osterwalder's stuff? It's quite sexy, actually. I mean, there's probably a bit less to it than meets the eye, but it's still very interesting. He developed a model that talks about a firm's business model, which consists of infrastructure. How do you actually create value for the customer? What is your value proposition? What is the offer that the customer is going to come to you to buy? How is value actually delivered to the customer? And how does the company make a profit? And Osterwalder and others argue that firms will succeed only if they develop and maintain a compelling value proposition for its target customers. So first of all, you have to understand your value proposition, you have to understand what underlies it, and you have to understand the target customers who are actually going to buy that value proposition. This is the sort of model that Osterwalder's put together. And remembering that value in itself is only a perception. It's only a perception by your customers. What you think may be great value, your customers may not think it's great value, right? So it's all about perception of value. And it's a perception of how value is delivered from beginning to end to the value chain. And no matter how good the value proposition is, Osterwalder says the firm will fail unless the expected value is delivered in full to the target customer. You've got to understand what your target customer wants. You've got to understand what value they place on that wanting, and you've got to understand how you deliver to that value. So it's quite a sexy little model: core capabilities, value proposition, cost structure, and revenue structure stream. It raises some very important strategic questions. What is the value you actually provide to your customers? What is it? Do you understand it? What is your target customer? What is the target market segment that you're going for? Right? You need to understand that, because unless you understand that, other people will come in and take that market segment from you if they understand it better. Customer relationship. How do you actually reach your customer? Core capabilities. Are you using your core assets in an optimal fashion? How do you actually create value? What is the process of the inputs and the outputs and in between the value that you create? How do you source your value? And how do the firm actually make its cost benefit? How does it actually use its costs and its profits to arrive at an overall profitability for the firm? And in order to do that, you've got to understand two things. You've got to understand where your profitability is coming from today, your current business model, what I call the strategic baseline, and importantly, where it's going to come from in the future, your strategic position. So it doesn't take into account future costs. It takes into account today's costs. It doesn't take into account future benefits. It only takes into account today's benefits. And of course, in between is your future profitability. Right? And your future profitability is going to be very different to today's profitability, potentially. Not only because your costs go up. This is something that the business as usual you concentrate on. Let me try my little light here. Oops, wrong one. I'll go back. I'll do that in a second. So what you're really trying to understand when you're talking about strategy is future costs, including losses, and future benefits, and future profitability. So strategy is all about working out the optimal, optimal is the wrong word because we can't have optimal, as good as you can get profitability in the future. So you have to understand your future costs, you've got to understand your future benefits, and hopefully your future profitability. And then, of course, underlying that, there's the future capital requirements, liquidity requirements, and risks. So each one of those, particularly the revenues and costs, will introduce new risks which are to do with your capital, your liquidity, and your other types of risk, including operational risk. Any questions on that? Fundamental message, it's all changing. The nice linear model we had in the past, well, you all know this, you deal with this day in, day out. The nice linear model we had in the past no longer obtains. There are chunks that are held together that your competitors may take away from you, or somebody may come in and take a benefit away from you. It used to be you could make a profit just by controlling the vertical integration from beginning to end. You can't do that anymore. Right? And the reason is technology, fundamentally. And the reason is that people will come in and take a piece of this. As Osterwalder says, somebody will come in and take this bit away from you, or that bit, or that bit, or that bit. You don't control that anymore. And people make money on that. Questions? Nope? Okay. It's quite an important concept. In the UK and in Europe, they're talking now about sensitivity of the business model. Okay, so if you're a banker in the UK and you go to your regulator, the first question they'll ask you is, do you understand your current business model, which they stress test quite regularly for credit risk. But whenever you're talking about we have a strategy, they'll ask you, well, what's your business model? Where do you hope to make your profits? Because it's no use just hoping to make a profit unless you can show us where your profits are. We're going to come down on you pretty heavily. on the strategy. There are four main types of strategy. There's a growth strategy, a productivity strategy, a restructuring strategy, and an innovation strategy. And actually, in practice, whenever you're dealing with strategy, you're dealing with some combination of those. Very rarely do you have a single focus on a strategy. You may have a main strategy, which is growth by acquisition, but in order to achieve growth by acquisition, you have to have subsidiary strategies. So what's growth? Growth's about growing profitability by extending products, targeting customers or new markets. Two major approaches to strategic growth. What's called organic growth. You grow within your existing structures and profitability. And acquisition, you grow by taking over or merging with other firms. There's actually a few more than this, but those are the two main ones. Productivity is about growing profitability by utilizing the firm's resources, especially their capital, more efficiently. Restructuring is about growing the profitability by restructuring the operations. Two main types: the reorganization of the existing organization resources, or disposals, getting rid of something. I always say that if you've got a strategy that contains no disposals, you don't have a strategy. Part of a big strategy is saying, what do we not want to do? That's as important as what do we want to do. And it's very, very hard for people to say, we want to stop doing this. Very, very, very hard. So if there's a strategy out there and a little bit of it is not getting rid of something to give you the leeway, to give you the time and the bandwidth to be able to handle something else, all you're really doing is just gathering up extra problems for the future. And innovation, it's growing profitability by developing new products and or processes. So there's those four main types of strategy, if you like, and they all have very different risks. Okay? Growth strategy is very different set of risks to an innovation strategy.